this is the Folksy Friend, and I am doing a lore-based breakdown and review of Rings of Power Episode 5. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. I started adding subtitles just in case being able to see what is actually being said helps at all with the clips that I've been showing. So he's clearly learning whatever language it is that the Harfoots speak, because like we've seen, he only speaks Quenya, so he can't communicate. So I think that this is really showing us that he's starting to adapt to his new world, his new environment. I do love that we get some singing in here. There are so many beautiful songs and poems in The Lord of the Rings that we don't typically get to see, and just a little jab at the purists out there. The only way to make a true Tolkien work in any way is to show all of the singing and the poetry and the rhymes also included in Tolkien's work. So if you really want something to be purely Tolkien, you better expect it to be some kind of really intense musical. Looking up at the moon and the stars, is he maybe thinking about Valinor, the Valar, Varda in particular? He does serve Manwë and Varda, and I believe one or two other Valar. I just wonder if these moments of him looking up at the sky, he's thinking of the Valar of the sky and the Valar of the stars, which would then kind of give us an indication that he is Gandalf. I remember when the internet was going crazy thinking that this was Anatar, which is the version of Sauron that is kind of shown to the elves. He is pretending to be a great giver of gifts and a messenger from the Valar. We now know that this is not him. This is in fact a her, a priestess of some kind. I'm honestly not sure what kind of priestess she is. My initial thought was that she must be part of the cult in Numenor at the kind of persuasion of Sauron. His influence leads to this cult forming where a lot of Numenorians then begin to worship Morgoth. And initially I thought that's who these ladies must be. They must be part of that cult. But we have no true indication that Sauron is even in Numenor. So there's no way that his cult would have formed yet, unless, as I'm kind of maybe thinking, he is a character that we have not seen, but is there moving behind the scenes. So if he is, as I suspect, somewhere in Region, potentially he has this kind of crew behind the scenes that's investigating things for him and that he's going to use to give himself more power if and when he finally makes it over to Numenor. So that would make sense if he saw the meteor crash and sent his little posse of really intense looking priestesses to go check it out. Otherwise, I don't really have an explanation for who these women might be. When he says it will be gone, is he referring to the sun, or is he referring to the fact that he will turn into something that can no longer stand the sun? I'm not sure how he would get rid of the sun unless, like Sauron has done in the past, he finds a way to create a fog or a haze or vapors, as they're called, to kind of block out the sun and make it safe for the orcs. He does that in Mordor. That's why Mount Doom is always kind of kicking up those fumes to keep the orcs kind of safe and protected. And then he sends out that darkness ahead of his armies when they go to attack Gondor. So if he's potentially finding a way to do that, then maybe he's thinking, okay, now I'm going to become part of the darkness like the orcs. But if he means he's going to somehow turn into something else, I don't know how on earth he would accomplish that. They mentioned the forest being bare, and it kind of reminds me of the weird, almost sick feeling that we get shown in Mirkwood much later when darkness starts to encroach on that forest. I'm wondering if this is kind of an indication of this forest being overtaken by darkness, which would then make sense as to why there are wargs there. So I watched the scene back carefully several times, and A warg never bites him or scratches him, as far as I can tell. So this injury to his arm is caused by either the impact of hitting the ground or, more likely, I think, the magic that he used to send the wargs away. It's interesting that it would be causing him physical pain. It's not something we ever see from the wizards when they use magic. And I say that because I'm increasingly thinking that this is in fact Gandalf, unless Sauron is playing some kind of long con here, which maybe, but it is seeming more to me like this is Gandalf, and it would be a little strange that he is experiencing pain for using his magic, unless he still just hasn't found his stride yet as a magic user, which would explain then why he ended up killing all those fireflies. He just doesn't quite have a handle on how to use magic in Middle Earth. So there's the first real indication that Pharazôn went against the former king and blocked his return to the old ways. Like I mentioned, Muriel and her father, and as we've seen, they are very much elf supporters. They believe in the old ways. Their prefixes are both Tar, whereas our Pharazôn is much more New Age Numenor. He does not want anything to do with the elves. He resents them, hates the Valar, and this is the first time we've actually been told straight up, like, you were part of the reason the king is no longer the king. And what's interesting to me is that his son seems to have no mind for politics at all. And Pharazôn is much more conniving and sneaky here than I think he is in canon. Then again, in canon, there is not much description of his day-to-day activities. So who knows? Maybe this is right on the money for what kind of personality he would have. In canon, Numenor does have several ports over in Middle-earth, and they do kind of run dominion over the men over there. So even though that happens much earlier than this in the timeline, like I've said in the past, they're condensing things and making several events kind of happen all at once for the sake of keeping the narrative flowing and us not being stagnant for several thousands of years at a time. So it seems like the ambition of Numenor taking over kind of the coastline of Middle Earth is going to happen right around now. Remember who can see into the future. I am not going to give away what it is exactly that he is seeing that kind of happens in the lore, because again, it's a show spoiler, but just remember, he can see into the future. It's hard to tell if he was trying to heal the wound on his arm or if he was trying to dispel magic from himself. That weird color of his veins almost looked like ice before the actual ice started forming. So I'm not sure if he was just trying to like get the ice out of his veins or if he was trying to freeze his arm in hopes of healing it. But what I think again is interesting is ice is typically a magic or a power associated with Morgoth, and not so much Sauron, he's more fire, but Morgoth, bad guys. Ice is usually not good. So if this is Gandalf, this would be the first time we've seen him use this particular kind of magic. So once again, there's that kind of tension between the elves and the dwarves. I mentioned in a previous video their kind of sordid history. They do not typically get along because fundamentally their species are opposed based on how they were created. Friendships between elves and dwarves are pretty rare. Like I mentioned, Galadriel gets along well with the dwarves, so will her daughter. Elrond and Celebrimbor in lore are some of the only ones that really have relationships with the dwarves. Celebrimbor more so, actually, than Elrond, though I think they've changed it up a little bit for the sake of the narrative in the show, and that's fine. But it would not put it past me, not one bit, for the elves to have taken something from the dwarves, not realized or cared about its significance, and just used it for something innocuous like a table. He just called him Elrond Half-Elven, essentially insinuating that he is lesser because of his human blood. He's saying, hey, I, current High King of the elves and Middle Earth, want you, you dirty little half-human, to sit down and do what I want. That's gross. This story, as far as I know, is completely fabricated for the show. The story of the elf and the Balrog fighting over some tree. I'm wondering if it's because they don't have the rights to the first age of Middle Earth, so they can't explain why a Silmaril would be in the mountain. So they had to create some sort of story to explain it. No, I feel like they could have left it with, we think a lost Silmaril is in the mountain. They didn't really have to explain why. In canon, the reason why there might be a Silmaril down under the mountain is because the last two Silmarils that are found by the last two surviving sons of Feanor, one is thrown into the sea by Maglor, the other is carried by the eldest son, Maedhros, as he flings himself into a chasm of lava, basically. So it's possible that when he flung himself in there, it happened to be at the base of the Misty Mountains. Possible. It just seems very silly to me that they've made up such an absurd sounding story. And maybe it doesn't sound absurd for someone who's not versed in the lore. And if not, that's fine. But to me, the story is absurd. So, what he's saying here and showing us with this kind of rot when he says this is but an outer manifestation of an inner reality, the evil and darkness that Sauron brings is almost like a physical thing. It's not just that he's a bad guy and he corrupts the people that are near him. The very presence of him, the existence of him, is almost like a a fog, I guess you could say, that affects everything that comes near it. When they say that they need to regain the light of the Eldar. Essentially, the longer the elves are away from the light of Valinor and away from the purity and the goodness and just the magic and the beauty of the Undying Lands, the more they kind of fade, the more they lose power and grow tired and weary, and it just gets to be too much. Imagine you live forever and you keep watching terrible things happen to everyone around you. You watch kingdoms rise and fall. You watch thousands of people die in wars. And it just starts to really weigh on you. And what they want to do is find a way to almost refresh themselves with light and goodness and happiness so that they can hold out against the dark longer. In the Silmarillion, in the very last section called Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, it does talk about the forging of the rings as a way to stave off the darkness of Sauron. And we know that one of these rings is made of mithril. So, what I'm thinking the show is doing here is tying in their weird story about the tree to explain how mithril is made and that why they need it to forge the rings to stave off the dark. Part of the reason why Lorien and Rivendell are able to stay as safe havens basically for elves is because Elrond and Galadriel have two of the rings. They're able to keep the dark forces at bay and allow the elves to survive and flourish. It is when the War of the Ring is taking place that that darkness starts to overcome the elves. That's part of the reason why Odwin gets kind of sick. It's not just because, oh, woe is me, I'm waiting for my boo to come back. No, she is physically being overtaken by the darkness. The light is going out of her. And if all the light goes out of her, she'll die. She'll leave her body. She'll end up in the halls of Mandos and game over. So what they're saying is not completely out of left field. It does have basis in lore. The idea that the darkness almost physically eats away at the elves, kind of like an acidic fog. It comes towards them, it eats at them, and they need to find a way to keep it at bay, to keep it out of their lands so that they can survive in Middle Earth longer. If they don't, they're going to have to go back to Valinor or die. And as Gil-galad says, if they leave, then it's likely that Sauron will just overrun the place. If the elves are gone, who has the power to stand up to Sauron and all his orcs? It's a bit of a stretch for me, the idea that just literally covering themselves in mithril is going to restore the light. I understand where it's coming from. Again, they need to keep away the darkness if they're going to survive, but it just sounds like they're going to walk around in like shiny sheets of mithril and then they'll be glowing and it'll be fine. So it is true that Elrond's father does take many journeys into the darkness, into the shadowy part of the sea that the Valar have kind of put up as a wall against anyone getting to them. And there is a great fear that he's going to be lost. No ship had ever made it to Valinor since they put up this kind of protective barrier. And I imagine that, yeah, Elwing would have wanted him to stay, but Arundel knew that he had to get to Valinor. He had to get the help of the Valar if they were ever to vanquish Morgoth and all of his armies. This is straight up gross manipulation of Elrond. This is someone he's known probably from the time he was fairly young. And the idea that he's kind of gaslighting him by telling him this story about his father. Ugh. I do I do accept this as a narrative for Galadriel. The idea that she's fought for so long and so hard that she doesn't really know how to put down the sword. Yes, she is described as being very strong, athletic. She could definitely wield a sword. Cool, that's fine. But that's not the only part of her. And the show is making that the only part of her. Again, that's my issue. I'm also not a huge fan of how close these two are. Friendship is fine, but here's the thing about the elves. They only ever love once. There's only ever one person for them. The only elf in history that took a second wife after his first wife kind of died, it's complicated, was Finwë. He had a wife that he loved very much, who essentially poured her literal soul into making baby Feanor, which is why he came out a red hot titanium baby and why he was so intense. He kind of took his mother's essence, and that's kind of what caused her to die. But once she sort of died, she left her body and went to the halls of Mandos and didn't want to come back. Finwë, after some time, was very sad and wanted joy again because there was joy for literally everyone else in Valinor. He was the only one that had this deep sadness in him. He was the only one that experienced loss. And so he remarried to Indis of the Vanyar and then had two more sons, which is why Feanor has two half-brothers. Feanor was very, very, very unhappy about this because, I mean, it is practically unheard of that an elf takes another spouse after the first. They literally become joined at the soul. So the idea of loving twice, it just does not happen except for this one case way back at the beginning of time. So any indication of flirty behavior or getting a little close romantically, that's just not acceptable. That it's not. I'm fine with Arondir and Bronwyn because she's his one, as far as we know. But the idea of Galadriel getting too close to Halbrand, if it ever develops into anything more than a friendship or potentially a one-sided crush on his side, anything more than that would be kind of sacrilege, frankly, to Tolkien's elves. It would go against what they are. I was right. He definitely has a shrine to Sauron in his closet. He's hoping that Adar is Sauron and that he's going to be lifted up and given prosperity, though I'm not sure why he thinks that when it didn't exactly work out for their ancestors. Even though there have just been kind of longing glances and, a little bit of cute flirty here and there, it is very obvious that Bronwyn is Arondir's one and only, just because he is physically touching her. Elves don't do that. If you remember the reaction of Haldir in the Two Towers when Aragorn hugs him, he is shocked because that is like going to third base with an elf. They are very aloof and they are not about the touchy-touchy. They don't hold hands with anyone but their spouse. No casual hugs, even, I mean, handshakes it's really not okay. The kind of utmost friendliness you see from an elf that is not your spouse is that is kind of the ultimate, "Hey, I really like you." So the idea that he is grabbing her shoulder, grabbing her arm, like, he's in love with this girl. Elves just don't do that otherwise. So I don't know if she knows that, so the idea that he's essentially declaring his intentions here by holding onto her shoulders, she might just think, "Okay, he's being very supportive in this moment," whereas Arondir basically just proposed. God, I love Doran. That kinda goes back to the "you've got sandstone in your granite." What is with these weird innuendos between Elrond and Durin? Why you gotta be so creepy, Gilgalad? There's more going on. It's not just wanting to protect the elves. In lore, he is very suspicious and wary of Sauron. Even when Sauron is disguised, he does not trust him. So if he in the show is being manipulated behind the scenes by Sauron, that would kind of go against the wisdom of Gilgalad. But I'm wondering if that is what's going on, because every time we see him, he is so suspicious. I just don't know any other way. This scene of the procession through Numenor really reminds me of the scene of the procession through Minas Tirith, the really sad procession where Denethor, the world's worst dad, sends Faramir and his remaining troops to retake Osgiliath, and everyone knows that they're gonna die. They're gonna die. There's no other way. And the people are throwing the flowers into the street, and there's the somber music, and Gandalf trying to convince Faramir not to go. This really reminds me of that. There's definite callbacks to the throwing of flowers, but these flowers are all bright and colorful. Everyone is cheering. It is the opposite of the Minas Tirith scene, but very similar, which makes sense because Gondor is founded from survivors of Numenor. So we're seeing a lot of similarities. The shape of the Numenorian helmets are similar to the Gondorian helmets. The shape of Elendil's helmet looks just like the Palace Guard helmets from Minas Tirith, those great big wings on the helmet. So we're seeing a lot of similarities here between the design of Gondor and Numenor. Do they just have armor that would perfectly fit a shorter elf just on standby? Just one day, a short elf will appear and she will need this very special elfy armor. So we'll hold on to it until then. All right, and that is the end of the episode. So a lot of setup, going places here. Numenor is on their way. They're getting on the boats. They're heading over. There's going to be a definite fight or some kind of skirmish at the tower with Bronwyn and her people versus the orcs. There has to be some kind of reckoning between Nori and Meteor Man based on what happened to her. And it seems like there's going to be a whole lot going on in the next episode. Overall, really liked the episode. I still really like the show. I do. I just hope that they let Galadriel grow a little more as a character. She's still feeling very one-sided. I have made peace with the styling of the elves. There's nothing I can do about it. The show's been made. But overall, I just want to know what is going on with Gilgalad. Why is he so suspicious? I hope we do find out. Hope you enjoyed this breakdown of episode 5, and I'll see you soon for episode 6. Thank you for spending some time with me, the folksy friend.